Now it's time to introduce our honored lecturer this evening, Dr. Glenn McRae, a leading expert on patient safety. I first met Glenn back in about 1995, 96, when we were both doing our Bachelor of Nursing together. And we figured out last night that Glenn was one of only 4 males that graduated from our class that year, so that was 2% of our graduating class. Not only did I do my BN with Glenn, but also with his lovely wife, Julie. They met in nursing school, in a health assessment lab, and I mean, who wouldn't fall in love in that kind of an environment? Back then, Julie was Julie Rankin, and if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because yes, she is indeed the daughter of Dr. Jim Rankin, who was in our faculty for, I don't even know how long, decades, long time. So Dr. Glenn McRae is a 3-time UCalgary alum who did his Bachelor of Science in Cellular, Molecular, and Microbial Biology in 1995, his Bachelor of Nursing in 1998, and then his PhD in 2018. He's currently based in Kelowna, BC, and has been with Interior Health since 2014. Glenn is the Vice President for Quality, Research, and Academic Affairs with Interior Health, and is an adjunct professor in the School of Nursing, Faculty of Health and Social Development at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. In his current role, Glenn oversees the departments of Quality and Patient Safety, Research, Health System Evaluation, and Academic Affairs at Interior Health. Previously, he held roles as Interior Health's Chief Nursing Officer, Professional Practice Lead, and Executive Director of Quality and Patient Safety. He has served in the Canadian Armed Forces, worked in the Middle East, and in the regional and provincial health authorities in 2 provinces. Glenn has also completed additional training in critical care nursing and also holds an MBA. He's worked tirelessly to improve processes in complex health systems in both Alberta and BC. And in 2021, he was recognized as a quality culture trailblazer at the annual Health Quality BC Quality Awards. Welcome, Dr. Glenn McRae.
I'm just going to change mics here. Is this one still on? I think we have to kill that one. Just put it down there. Sorry. We'll see if this one works. Is this one working? No. How about now? Are you hearing me? If I talk this way, will you all be able to hear me? Yeah. Okay. Now, I was told for pictures, I got to wind this wire up a little bit so that it doesn't stick out. So just give me a second. This is the best part of the lecture. Okay. All right, here we go. Hi, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And in this lecture, if you want to raise your hand, if you want to shout out stuff, that's totally okay. We can be interactive. It's surreal being back here 27 years later with Catherine as the interim dean, my wife sitting in the front row, in a city that meant so much to me and my family for so many years. My mom and dad are in the front row, and I think it's the first time my dad's ever seen me speak. I did all these slides for my mom. She's legally blind, so she thinks they're excellent, but she'll be able to hear everything I say. And it's also full circle. This club, actually, I was never a member of this club, but I used to come to this club because back when I was in the Canadian Forces, our honorary colonel would host fireside chats for young officers. And we'd come here for professional development, for a nice meal, for a beverage, and this is sort of the start. Maybe it was my first journal club, but it was about the Canadian Forces and about the military and how that would all work. So it was amazing. So I don't live here anymore. I live here in what's colonially known as Kelowna, on the traditional unceded territory of the Silks Okanagan people. This is a view from Cedar Creek Winery, which is right down the road from my house. It's where my son had his longest standing job. He worked there for 4 or 5 years. We're still members. I think we're going there next week or the week after to pick up wine. So that's where I came from. So how did I get there? So in preparing for this talk, I came across this concept of the accidental career. And I thought, well, everyone's career is kind of accidental. I don't know how many people planned day 1, day 2, day 3 in their career. And this article talks about the ability to master the art of an accidental career. And I thought that was odd. What does that mean? How do you master something that's going to be, forgive me for this term, on accident? Because kids now say on purpose and on accident. They don't say by accident. So how do you master something that happens on accident? And what they were saying in this article is that it's not really about making sure your career goes where you want it to be, but if you make certain decisions and keep yourself open to certain simple rules, the complexity of life is going to steer you in a good way. And the rules are let life change you, never stop learning, and find creative ways to add value. So in doing that, I had to look back at my career, and I can think of exactly one point where I got career advice about how to go towards a specific job in a certain way. And it was my last year of nursing school. It was in a course called Health Leadership. And it was taught by Dr. Kathy Oberle. And what Kathy said is, you need to go out, and I was in the Army at this time, by the way. They were paying for my nursing school. So she said, you have to go out and you need to find a job you want to have one day, look up the job description, look up the requirements, and then plot a path on how to get there from here. So I did. But I said, I've already got a career, Kathy. I'm in the Army. They tell me where I'm going to live. Because you have to pick one anyway. So I did, and I picked what I thought was going to be the most impactful stretch assignment of my life, and that was patient care manager. And she said, dream bigger. And I said, I don't know. That's about to become a new grad, that's a pretty powerful position, a pretty influential position. And I got to have that position once. Where I did it was called the head nurse, but I got to be the head nurse. And it was the hardest job I ever had in my life. And it was the hardest job for a few reasons. Probably the biggest reason was the expectations I had to navigate. Days earlier, I was working side by side with nurses that I was now approving vacation for, and managing, and assessing, and disciplining, and hiring. I had to deal with their expectations. I had the expectations of patients and families. I had the expectations of the public, the government in this case, the senior leaders, my colleagues in management. Because if I was too good a manager, they'd look bad, and if I was too, I'd steal their staff would move, it was terrible. So all these things happened along with real clinical challenges around staffing and errors and injuries and awesomeness too. But when all that happened in all those moments at all that time, what I realized is this is the least skilled I'm ever going to be in management, and they've given me the hardest job. And that's what we do in nursing. We start off with our hardest job, and then it gets easier from there. So as I plotted my path, I decided to look at what are the moments of curiosity and tension for my career. I didn't know about these 3 rules, so I didn't proactively plan a good career. I happened upon a career, and now I'm reflecting back, or what are these key moments of curiosity and tension? And some of them are aha moments, some of them are just moments of clarity, and some of them are these flashbulb moments, the moments you tell time from. One such flashbulb moment, Julie shared it with me. We just moved to Saudi Arabia. We sold everything we owned because we wanted to become expats and have a tax-free status and go live in the Middle East and have an adventure. I'd just left the military after a 12-year career. We moved there. We've been there 6 weeks. And then on September 11th, 2001, we're on a bus heading back to our compound with a largely Western expat bus, and we learned about the attacks in New York on 9/11. And that changed my life forever. And it changed my life because we decided to stay for 3 years in the Middle East and have an adventure. Other people packed up and went home. My parents, Julie's parents, said, get out of there, come home. We didn't. We stayed and we had a remarkable time. So this is one of those moments in my career that changed it because I let life happen to me. But a little more basic. Back to nursing school. This is supposed to have wheels on it, but I couldn't find one with wheels. For those of you who aren't nurses, any nurses want to shout out what that is? Yeah, it's a first portable toilet. We were in our first clinical placement at, I can't remember if it was Foothills or Rocky View. It was our first inpatient acute clinical placement, group of nurses, and there was 6 to 8 of us. can't remember if it was 6 or 8 because I can't remember if you count the instructor or not. But back then what would happen is you'd have your pre-conference, so you'd see your colleagues. You'd have your post-conference, so you'd see your colleagues. You would sometimes see them in the nursing station. You'd sometimes see them in the med room, sometimes on break. And on this day, I remember I was in the dirty utility room with another nurse. We were working. And a third nurse, well, because you kind of gave away how I came to know one of the nurses. No, but so a third nurse came in the room, a good friend of ours, wheeling a commode with a basin full to the rim of, well, you can know what was in there. And we're in there, we're working away, and she came in, and without thinking, she looked at us, hey, and she took the basin full of poop. And she dumped it into the big metal sink. It was right next to the hopper where she could have flushed it, but just dumped it in and went, oh, well, you know the word she used, oh, poop. She didn't say poop. And she panicked. And she panicked and said, you, go watch the door. One of our colleagues went and watched the door, and she goes, help. And so I handed her a toilet brush, and she started running the water in the sink. And sure enough, she'd plugged the sink. And so she's stirring. She is stirring a cauldron of poop, just praying that the water goes down. And she had someone on guard because our nursing instructor was a type. Okay, it was you, Julie. I wasn't going to out you, but it was Julie on guard.
I was on guard.
You were on guard. Because our nursing instructor was a tyrant. And I don't mean that in a kind way looking back. I mean, she probably thought she had high standards and was imparting high standards upon us. But her habit was to name, blame, shame, retrain in front of all of us. So anyway, the poop went down, sigh of relief, coast was clear, out we went. Now, that same nurse was giving her first IM injection. And that nursing instructor was standing behind her, looking over her shoulder. And this is an instructor who would put you on a learning contract. So I remember one nurse got put on a learning contract because while drawing up an IM solution, a bleb of fluid left the top of the needle, ran down the needle and touched the hub. And this was on the needle that was being used to draw up the solution. It wasn't on the needle that was going to be used to give the injection to the patient. And she lost her mind on this nurse and berated her and embarrassed her, put her on a learning contract, shared this horrible lack of manual dexterity in front of all of us. And this was the instructor we had. I won't name her, but this was our instructor. So this day, this other nurse, not the one who had the learning contracts, given her first IM injection. Everything's ready. She's prepped the site, correctly found the greater trochanter, reached up, found the spot, marked it, all the stuff you do, and was getting ready to give her first injection, took the cap off, poked her finger. So the nurses in the room kind of know what may have happened next. That instructor didn't notice. And that nurse made the decision to go ahead and give the injection anyway. Because it was inconceivable that she would admit to this error. And this haunted this nurse to this day. She doesn't practice today. I don't know if it's because of that, but it was one of those moments of curiosity and tension about the role of fear and its impact on safety. So I have my own stories. I can tell them later if you want. I have one that I tell everyone because it's the one I remember that makes me shiver, but I didn't want to get that nervous in front of all of you right now. But I tell my stories. So one of the pieces of advice you get in this program is let life change you. And man, did it change me. So I was working overseas, and I just successfully helped the organization. I was a manager, head nurse in the emergency department, and just helped the organization go through a successful joint commission. I just realized I hadn't buttoned the wrong button up. Sorry, you should have told me, Mom. Gone through a successful joint commission accreditation survey. We become accredited. The hospital staff loved it. The senior leaders, princes and princesses said, good job. And they said, in fact, we love you so much, you're going to become the quality improvement nurse. I go, awesome. What's that? They go, well, we don't know, but you get a lab coat, and you get an office, which was a closet, and a lab coat, which is the nursing's uniform of the day. And you get a closet, and you get to kind of figure out how you're going to keep this momentum we gained starting to prepare for accreditation. That's awesome. And so this is probably 5 years, 6 years after I graduated, and I've been working critical care, emerge, and the chief medical officer called me into the office, and he said, Glenn, you're the quality improvement nurse. A young neonate has just died, and died as a result of a major major medical error, a medication error in this case, and we need you to figure out what happened. And it turns out that this nurse, the child was the son of a nurse who used to report to me in the emergency department. And he had engaged a very influential member of the local government, and they were going to hold the organization accountable to find out what happened. There was talk about blood money, there were all these things. And he goes, but you know what, Glenn, I know you can do this because I got this book. And he gave me a book that had just come out a few months earlier called The Step-by-Step Guide to Root Cause Analysis. And he said, what I want you to do is go out there, use this book, find out what happened, and fix it. That was my instructions. And so what I didn't know now, or then, that I know now, is there's this concept called Wilfy Whiff. There it is, Wilfy Whiff. What you look for is what you fix. And so I was looking for a root cause. And the way this worked, this particular patient was on ECMO. So that's extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. For those who don't know, it's kind of like there's a heart-lung machine external to the child's body that's oxygenating the blood and taking stuff out of the blood. And that system has to be heparinized to avoid clotting. So it has to get heparin. And the way we were giving heparin to this patient was using a syringe driver. And it was hooked up to the inlet side of the ECMO circuit. And I went looking for a root cause. Remember, what you look for is what you find. I'm looking for a root cause. I found it. On this day, that syringe driver has 2 prongs, kind of this way. And the prongs broke. And when the prongs broke, all the heparin in that syringe was sucked immediately into the circuit, into the baby's body, and the baby died. Now, we don't use ECMO when people are well. So this was a seriously ill child, and this was like a Hail Mary last attempt. But almost certainly a massive overdose of heparin wasn't going to increase the likelihood of surviving, and ultimately in this case resulted in that patient's death. But I found my root cause. I was brand new, step-by-step guide, found my root cause. And the theory is if you find the root cause and fix that, nothing else matters, because if you get the root, the rest can't happen because you got it at the root. You cut the weed off at the root. You pull it out by the roots. And so the next acronym is Whiffy Whiff. So what you look for is what you find is Wilfy Whiff. Whiffy Whiff is what you find is what you fix. So I put in the fix based on what I thought would result in safer care for going forward for that area. And management, they loved it. I got high fives, I got pat in the back, good job, Glenn. It was simple and targeted, and that's what we were teaching people. A recommendation when things go wrong is only good if it's smart. And we still teach this to nursing students today. It should be specific, measurable, achievable, related timeliness. If it's not any of those things, it's weak. Don't bother. Only smart recommendations matter. Don't make weak recommendations like get along or understand each other's work or focus on resilience or high reliability. Make smart ones. So I made a smart one. And I should have known better that that recommendation wasn't good enough. Because as I mentioned, I spent 12 years in the Canadian Forces. And when I was in the Canadian Forces, I started off as a medic and I became a nurse. And as a medic and as a nurse, the rule in the Canadian Forces back then was every soldier had to know how to use every 1- and 2-person weapon we had. And one of them was a claymore. It's called an anti-personnel mine, but it's actually a directional person-activated mine. So there it is. So this is a claymore anti-personnel mine. And the way personnel, sorry, not personal. You can be personal, but it's an anti-personnel mine. And the way it works is you take it and you put it someplace where you think the enemy is going to go walking, whether it's in a tree or on the ground. And then you run and hide in the bushes somewhere, trail the cord behind you. And when the enemy goes by, you slam on the button 3 times. Now 3 times is back from when there used to be a crank you used to use on this. And you had to hit the crank 3 times to get enough charge, or at least to make sure it worked and didn't fail the first 2 times to cause this thing to then blow up. And then this was an electric one with a battery, but we still hit it 3 times because that's how we were always trained. Kind of like for the nurses in the room that we still teach the Holman sign to try and rule out DVTs and other scenarios, and even though it doesn't work. So, but we teach this. And so what happened though is that from time to time, it went off and the person pressing the button got blown up. Now you can imagine these people are highly motivated to get this right. So what was the simple solution? Here's the simple solution. If those can't see, it says front toward enemy. And it's raised, and it's so you can read it. Guess what was on the other side? Back. It said back. And then it said poisonous if eaten. Because some people over in Vietnam found out that if you ate the explosive, you got high. So some of the soldiers. So it said back and poisonous if eaten. And guess what happened when they made this change? No, they kept every once in a while blowing themselves up. It's a simple solution. It should work, right? But there's a couple things that people forget about simple solutions is that they have to work in the real world. And in the real world, back in this case in the war in Vietnam, there was drugs everywhere. There was illegal drugs, and they were giving soldiers drugs to keep them awake called pep pills. Sometimes you had to set this up in the dark because the enemy didn't always wait for you to allow you to do the daylight and they're coming to dark. Sometimes you had to do it in the dark. And remember, this was a conscript army. There were soldiers who couldn't read. So this very simple solution in a different environment, in a different world, didn't work. It might have made it safer, it didn't make it safe. So this is what a neonatal ICU looks like when you're going to do ECMO. Now this is without the patient, without the nurses, without the family, without the perfusionist. And this is the similar environment to where I investigated and did my review. And in my review, I found the root cause. I told you all about it. But I also found other things. And the other things I found were, for example, the perfusionist who's responsible for this circuit that's outside the baby's body would regularly go on breaks. And go for a smoke break in this case. And he was from a higher status passport country. And he would tell a nurse from a lower status, this is not my language, this is how it worked over in the Middle East, with a lower status passport to watch his patient. And she goes, I don't know anything about the circuit. He goes, just do it. And arguing would mean she would lose her job and have to go back to wherever her country was. So she did it. And she knew nothing about the circuit. And on the day that accident happened, when those prongs broke and delivered that massive overdose of heparin, so that would have been fatal anyway, she panicked because she knew that circuit had to be heparinized. And she ran over and grabbed another syringe full of heparin, hooked it back up, not realizing the prongs had broke, and it got sucked in, delivering a second massive dose of heparin. And you know how much heparin was in the syringe? Not as much as you needed for the shift. Days and days worth of heparin. So this was it's inconceivable. It couldn't believe that would happen. But it did happen. And guess what? The hospital, with all the money it had gotten into a bad relationship with some of the vendors. And the vendors basically eventually wrote us off their books and said, you're not our customers anymore. And because they weren't our customers, we were not getting safety updates and safety information. And I'll tell you one of the things that came out around that time, I'm not sure if it was just before or just after, but it's in the manual now of the Smith syringe driver manual as of today. It says this. It says, don't use syringe drivers on the inlet side of an ECMO circuit because the pressure is so much, it'll suck them in. So I knew all that. I shared all that with the organization. But our methodology was root cause analysis. Let's find out what went wrong, fix it, and move on. The final step in root cause analysis is you get back in a room with all the people who were involved in the case in the first place. And you present your findings and your recommendations to them. And I did that. And they looked at me like, what are you talking about? I was an emergency nurse. I wasn't an NICU nurse. I later became a critical care nurse. But I didn't work in that setting. And they basically looked at me, rolled their eyes, blank stares. And what they knew was that my fix, almost certainly the correct fix for the root cause I had found, almost certainly, assuming you could have seen the thing was about to break, would have prevented that bad outcome from happening, was completely insufficient to make it safer for the next patient, for the next person. They knew that. I didn't. I do now. So this idea of never stop learning. There's a few places I've learned from in the years. You see our alma mater down there on the bottom because I spent a lot of time here. Actually, I did a whole extra degree because I spent a lot of time at the Den. And my first degree, molecular microbial biology, but don't ask me about a gram stain, but I did a degree in that. But we learn. And so one of the things I learned, and one of the things I get to do in this learning is I got to teach all over. I got to go all over North America. I got to go to the UK. I had a chance to go to the Middle East. And I survey for Accreditation Canada today, so I still do that work. And I'm off to Dubai in December to do something like that. And one of the things I noticed immediately walking into a hospital or place is how it feels. Yeah. The culture. You see it on a unit, you see it in a hospital, you see it, and it's a real thing, but you can't calculate it, you can't describe it, it just feels that way. So we'll come back to culture in a minute. But one of my favorite things to do as someone with a nursing education is go talk to nursing students. And I always give a little safety talk, and sometimes it's second year, sometimes it's third year, sometimes it's to nurses just about to do their first medication administration. They're going into the course where they're going to give drugs for the first time. And I tell stories about my own adverse event, my own medical error, how things went horribly wrong. And at the end of one of these lectures, a nurse came up to me, a nursing student, and she said, Glenn, she goes, I got something for you, I think it's going to help. She goes, there's this amazing resource called Nurse Journal. And in just 3 minutes, you could learn about the 5 most common mistakes made by new nurses. It's out there, it's for you. And I said, oh, that's amazing. I wish I would have known back then that this was out there. So what are the 5 most common things? And medication errors was one, okay, I get that. But so was calling the physician without all the information. And so was not doing all the stuff to prevent your patients from falling. So it was a pretty suspect list she was declaring for me. And so I said, well, tell me more about this list, about what this article would say. She goes, well, it's 3 minutes, and you can get credit for it. And here's what you need to know. If you want to prevent and make care safer, here's what you need to know. For the nurses in the room, you need to know that the reason you were making errors is because you didn't understand that you're supposed to achieve perfection. It's imperative. If you're not achieving perfection, you're not a good nurse. That's what's out there. But even better, for medication errors, number one type of error nurses are making, just leave your personal life at home. When you walk in the door, just pay attention to your patient, leave it at home. Now what's interesting is some people say, yeah, you should. And because there's a pendulum swing. There's the people who are on their cell phones talking to their families, and there's the people who grew up with moms who you had to call the station and say, can I please speak to Nurse Margaret? And they would say, yeah, she'll be in 37 minutes or 40 minutes, she'll be back from what she's doing, and I will let her know to call, and she'll call if she has time. So life has changed a little bit, but nursing students have this beautiful, beautiful advice. So I asked nursing students and some instructors, not putting any fingers at anyone in the room, I say, I made medication errors growing up. Medication errors are still happening. Here's some data, some recent data to say they're still happening. As often as 1 in 4 administrations has an error of some kind. I asked nursing students, why? What are these nurses doing? And invariably, in that class, the nursing students, and almost always the instructors say, they're failing to follow the rights of medication administration. If they just followed the rights, they would never make an error. And for those who don't know, these are the 5 rights. They make sense. You should give the drug to the right patient. You should give them the right drug. It should be the right dose, and you should give it at the right time, and you should give it the right way. So you shouldn't give this suppository orally, and this is, do it. And so I talked about 5 rights, and this LPN in one of the classes said, Glenn, shook her head at me, maybe there was 5 back when you were, but we're a lot safer now. Now there's 7. And I said, there's 7. Okay, right reason. Okay, right documentation. That's going to stop medication errors from happening. Okay, right documentation. And then someone else said, you know what? We can make it even better. Instead of 5, there needs to be 7. Let's do 9. 9 sounds amazing. Here's the 9. I apologize for those in the corner who can't see. But what it says is now they've got right action, right form, right response. But hold on the 7, there was this other one, what was it, right reason. So is right reason not important? So is it 9 or is it 10 or maybe right reason doesn't matter? And then someone put out 13. And right reason must be important because it's back. So right reason's back. But there's 4 new ones. And then, but they forgot these 2. And then, oh my goodness. And guess what I know from working in patient safety the whole time? We have just as many medication errors with 13 rights or 15 rights or 10 rights as we did with 5 or 0 or none. So what is it about these rights? Well, clinicians must love it, right? The only reason this is here is clinicians and nursing students must think this is helpful. Here's what they think. Apologize, this is real language, not my language. There's a few swears in here. Holy moly, I'm stuck in the Stone Age. I'm going to read some for people in the back of me and I'll be able to see. Many people think 5's hard enough to remember. 13, the rights are getting out of hand. Good grief, you'd never get your meds done. Especially now when we're short-staffed. And this is my favorite. Whoever thought of this shite must have forgotten that the last 6 or 7 all follow from the first 1 to 6, and they didn't consider any of the value add or utility or use on the unit. So we're still teaching this, we're still doing this is still the case. Maybe there's gonna be 15 rights, 25 rights. I'm not sure how many double checks are needed or independent triple checks, I don't know. But if healthcare is more complicated than things like this, watch out, don't crash, think quality, do it right the first time, then how do we actually make it safer if it's not through lists, through conversations? So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of the things as we look to get towards the end of the lecture. I'll just walk through and share a few of the things that I learned over my career. So I was in 2004 coming back to Calgary Health Region from the Middle East. And I was waiting to come back to work because there was a hiring freeze. There's always hiring freezes. There was a hiring freeze. And while I was waiting, there was a very public, very serious critical incident where 2 patients received potassium chloride instead of sodium chloride in their dialysate solution. And I had the opportunity to work with the daughter of one of the ladies who died for years and years, Judge Deborah Prouse. We still teach and work together. But this was this event that happened. It was playing out in the media. It was in the media for far longer. And the Calgary Health Region, to their credit, did something other than find the root cause and fix it, which really was these 2 bottles looked the same. They were stored together. That day, a pharmacy tech grabbed this bottle instead of that bottle, made up 36 bags of dialysate. Out they went. 2 patients died. Quick thinking meant that 33 or 34, depending on how you counted the bags, didn't. But they made the decision to overhaul the entire way they approached their quality and safety program. And for years, up until Alberta Health Services was formed, they were leading published beacons of quality and patient safety in the world. And I had the opportunity to be the very first manager of patient safety in that area. And because I had that opportunity, and because of experts like Dr. Jan Davies in this area, Dr. Ward Flemons, Bruce McLeod, and others, they brought in speakers from all over. And one of the speakers was a guy named Dr. James Reason. And Dr. James Reason's talked about a safety culture. Remember I said culture trumps, and we didn't really know what it meant. So he talked about a safety culture. And he said, in the context of things going wrong, in all important ways, a safety culture is really the same as an informed culture. And he said it's got 4 subcomponents. And those 4 subcomponents are, people have to tell you what they know about how to make the system safer. There has to be a just culture, or an appropriate accountability that would say, just like there's a range of actions and behaviors someone might engage in, from punching a patient to making a slip, there should be a range of responses. So it's not blame-free, it's appropriate accountability. And we should know that in advance of something going wrong. We should commit to learn from all the things we should learn. And then there's this thing called flexibility. We spent a lot of time on the first 3 because we understood them. We ignored flexibility. I'll come back to flexibility. But the other thing Dr. Reason's famous for is Swiss cheese. Can I just, this is the audience participation part. Can I see a show of hands if you've heard of the Swiss cheese model? Yeah, it's this amazing model. And what this amazing model says is it's a way to try and understand the healthcare system. And it says, over here, you have these things in the system that can hurt people. Over here, you have hurt, harm. And in between the things that can hurt people and the harm are all these barriers, defenses, and safeguards, and they're always moving. And he said, let's just make every barrier, defense, and safeguard a piece of cheese. So they're always moving, all these pieces of cheese, all these pieces of cheese are moving. And they're all imperfect. And the imperfections are holes, therefore Swiss cheese. And in the Swiss cheese model, what they understand is that most often, the stuff that's going to hurt people doesn't, because it hits a barrier, defense, or safeguard and bounces off. Every once in a while, all the pieces of cheese line up, gets all the way through, causes harm. And if you believe that model, then the way you make care safer is you improve the quality of your barriers, defenses, and safeguards, or you add more pieces of cheese. And students love to say, Glenn, you know, the patient's actually the last piece of cheese. You're right. So there's another piece of cheese, the patient, used to be the nurse. And then they use this to try and, so this is wonderful. It creates a great conversation. Everybody remembers it. You can explain it just as quickly as I just did. Management love it. And then they use it to try and explain a case. So if something happened, we borrowed a medication from another patient because the fax machine was, this is an older example, because the fax machine wasn't working, and we ended up giving a medication to a patient they were allergic to, and they died. And this is from the comprehensive unit safety program that Johns Hopkins started following the Josie King death. Dave King was someone we worked with from there, and he shared this story. And the idea was that there's all these pieces of cheese out there, all these different things that failed. And when you talk to nursing students, you know what they focus on? They focus on this, that the nurse borrowed medication from another patient, which you're not supposed to do. Therefore, it's the nurse's fault. We should hold the nurse accountable. Now, you talk to nurses in the real world, they borrowed medication from other nurses all the time to get their medications done. And they'd replace it later when they had stock. And today, with automated dispensing machines, they override often or go into ward stock often, and that creates mistakes. But it's the reality of how things work. So Swiss cheese is okay, but again, the only fix, if you believe in the Swiss cheese model, is more cheese or make the hole smaller. And Dr. Reason himself in 2006 said, it's actually not a very good model to understand why things go wrong or to understand how complex systems work. So stop doing it. But we keep doing it. And we have an obligation. We have an obligation when things go wrong to provide patients and families with our most accurate understanding of what went wrong. They deserve that. They're entitled to it. I want to know it. Staff want to know it. Everyone wants to know it. And we do that through retrospective reviews. The problem with retrospective reviews is they're retrospective. So it's always a version of the truth. It's truthy. And we can't help ourselves, but when we do retrospective reviews, we want to fix the system because of them. So this study here by Hibbert talks about a couple hundred sentinel events in Australia over a 5-year period that were reviewed. On average, every review generated 5 new recommendations to redesign the healthcare system. And if you work in the healthcare system, it's really hard to redesign, let alone 1,137 times in 5 years. It's hard. And they said, no one's implementing all of them. Okay? No one's implemented all the recommendations. We spent all that time making, tracking, writing down. But maybe they're just not very good. So they looked at the recommendations and they said only 8% of them are any good. And what did they mean by good? A good recommendation is the one that took the human being, the nurse, the skilled clinician, out of the system and put in a forcing function, a rule, or an automation. Those were the good rules. And I guess my question is this. Does anyone think a single bad case or a couple bad cases is sufficient evidence to redesign a whole healthcare system? What if we had a good outcome, a single good outcome because of an error? Would I get to redesign the healthcare system then to continue to generate good outcomes? I wouldn't, or at least in my career, I've never seen that happen ever. So is retrospective reviews into cases that have very specific context, including the human beings themselves involved, is that a good way to make care safer? I'd put to you it isn't, and this is part of what I talk about in my other work. So again, back to Swiss cheese. Because of Swiss cheese, there's lots and lots of fixes. This is Australia, occupational health and safety data from a gentleman named Sidney Decker. Now, Sidney Decker is also a patient safety expert. But what he was saying back in 2019 is in Australia was last year, 2018, in Australia, you spent $250 billion on compliance with safety rules. For every 10 people working in your area, you have one person responsible to make sure the other 9 people are doing what they're supposed to do. And he's got pictures of someone with a high visibility fluorescent jacket and a hard hat and steel-toed boots standing in the middle of a sandy field in the outback because the rules say you got to wear a hard hat, high-vis vest, and boots. I don't know what was going to fall on them, but that was the rules. And we do it in healthcare too. This is a very busy slide for everyone in the back, but it doesn't matter. You're not meant to read any of it. What it simply says is in the first 24 hours, this is an NHS hospital, when you walk into the emergency department with a certain type of hip fracture, there's 76 applicable guidelines that need to be considered for that patient. And those 76 applicable guidelines are buried in up to 8,000 pages of policy running over 2 million words, and there's not a guideline to tell the clinician which guideline to use. And so what would happen if you tried to use all the guidelines? You would grind the organization to a halt. That's why work to rule is such an effective labor negotiation tool. Because if you follow every rule in your organization, it will be ground to a halt. So what do we expect? Like in the real world, what do we expect to happen in a situation like that? We expect skilled clinicians to use their discretion, their expertise, their information, their colleagues, to make calls with imperfect information blinded to the outset, or to the outcome. That's what we expect in the real world. So I had Swiss cheese, now we have gorillas. I love gorillas. And has anyone ever seen I'm not going to do a gorilla video, I promise. But has anyone ever seen a gorilla video in a lecture like this? No? Oh, I wish I would have done it then. No. So there's the gorilla video, and it's not actually a gorilla video, but it's about a gorilla. There's two psychologists, who did this study, Simons and Chabry, and what they essentially did, it was so famous, because such a famous study, they wrote a book about it. They would get people to look at something. I'm not going to play it, but it's there. You can look at it. You can look up the gorilla video. And what they would say is there's two groups of people in this video. There's people wearing white shirts and there's people wearing black shirts. And they're going to pass basketballs back and forth. And we want you to count how often someone in a white shirt passes a basketball to someone in a white shirt. And we want you to count. And we're going to run this passing exercise for 90 seconds. And they run it for 90 seconds. And about 30 seconds in, a gorilla walks through, stops, looks at everyone watching, beats his chest, beats their chest 3 times, and then walks off the stage. And at the end, they say to people, how many passes were there? And the right answer is 15. And most often, we get between 13 to 16. We're pretty good at counting passes when we're told to count passes. And then they say, who saw the gorilla? And 50% of the people, or less, see the gorilla. In fact, they're so convinced there's not a gorilla that when you show them the video slowly with the gorilla, they think you've inserted another gorilla. Okay. So the idea was to talk about sort of inattentional blindness and about how we are, the power of focus and perception and the limitations of human perception. That was the idea. And great story. We'll talk about whether it's actually useful in patient safety or not, but it's a great story that a lot of people share. So there's utility there. Well, so what? So just recently, like about 3 or 4 years ago, a group of researchers reached out to over 700 different anesthesia groups that they found through Facebook. And they selected and invited people to review 5 cases. They had 699 respondents. They had more respondents, but they eliminated the people who weren't anesthesiologists or anesthesiology students. And they sent them a set of cases, 5 cases. And those cases had history and physical, they had blood work, they had ECG, and they had chest x-rays. And on the chest x-ray, they put a shadow. And the shadow is actually, that monkey's face. And they gave people credit if they saw a shadow. And they give people credit that they saw the gorilla. It's a gorilla, not a monkey. I apologize for the anthropologist. But yeah, so 4.1% of the 699 respondents made any comment whatsoever about the 5th film having that shadow and that gorilla's face on it. So it happens in healthcare too, it turns out. We have this inattentional blindness, or when we're focused on one thing, we don't see. But their scenario was like, look, looking isn't the same as seeing. But is this going to help anyone? Remember not to forget to see the gorillas? I don't know. But the idea was to say, when we're designing systems with humans in mind, let's consider limitations of humans. Let's look at triggers and alerts and warnings to draw people back. So that's a good thing. And then we tried this thing for those of you who are working clinically. We tried quiet zones for medication administration. Now they design space to have those deliberately. But back then we took good space and we tried to make it quiet. We put signs on it. And we found that's where people went to read their books or have their lunch or make their phone calls, do anything. But actually, to begin with, it was a medication zone. It just became a nice quiet zone. So the concept didn't survive the reality of a culture or climate on a unit. I've just got a couple more examples and we're going to wrap it up. But we have in healthcare this desire to borrow from industry, whether it's aviation and checklists or whether it's public safety. And this is a public safety example. As I mentioned, I was a medic, and I actually spent a better part of 4 years working with Alberta Health Services EMS, and they had a very strict rule around scene safety. And the way scene safety worked You don't enter the scene until it's safe for you. So in this situation, power lines on top of a vehicle, even if someone in there is giving birth or dying or hemorrhaging, you don't go in there because you will become the second victim. And now somebody else has to save you, and then someone has to save them. And it's a rule, but it's also an expectation amongst everyone. We know that. Now, healthcare, inpatient care, long-term care, we have this other scenario. So it's a bizarrely disturbing photo, but it's around falls and the technology that's been put in place to prevent falls. And I want to, for those of you who practice, I want you to think about this scenario. There's a cognitively unwell individual, bariatric patient, requires 2-patient lift with a ceiling lift on your unit. You walk by that patient's room, and you notice he, in this case, is just about over the bed rail. You yell for help. No one cares. No one cares. You know you're going to hurt yourself if you try and help that man. What do? Do you go and try and ease the fall? Do you try and catch them? Do you stand back and let them fall? So the rule would be, if it's not safe for you, you need to make sure it's safe for you. Do what you can, but don't put yourself in harm's way. Which is fine until you run in the expectation of family, public, others. What if that patient fell, hit their head, ended up with a bleed and died? Was not doing anything okay, even if it was the rule. What's the moral distress there? What's the expectation of your colleagues, the family? What if you went in and eased them to the ground, hurt your back, and you can't nurse ever again, but they didn't have a head injury? Did you do the right thing? So rules are great until they hit reality, and then we rely on people to make calls. And we can't judge them in hindsight based on the call they made at the moment without knowing the outcome. Last example from industry, SBAR this came in for me around 2004. This is when I first heard about SBAR. It's an acronym that means Situation, Background, Assessment, Recommendation. It came from the US Nuclear Navy. And what it was supposed to be in the US Nuclear Navy was in a moment, in a command situation, in a tense situation, anybody could break through the hierarchy of that ship and deliver very simple, straightforward information that would get an immediate response. So if you're doing an SBAR, everybody shut up. Captain, everybody, and you listened. And then you made your call. So that's SBAR. In 2003, Kaiser Permanente brought it into their critical care communication world. And then 2004, we brought it in place in Calgary. And I'm pleased to say it's alive and well where I work now, probably where you work now. You're laughing because she knows where this is going. She didn't hear this, but Julie works in my organization as well. And I've seen it in every organization. The way SBAR works today is one of my staff will come to me and say, Glenn, I got this great idea. And I'll say, I don't have time to listen to you right now. Can you write me an SBAR? Can you put it down on paper? And can you talk to your friends, run it by a few people, then email it to me, and then we'll talk about it on my one-to-one in 2 weeks. It's become a way to format a memo. And that's how it's used across the country, despite being, it's also in critical communication, but it's been so watered down, it's a required practice by accreditation, but no one's practicing the way it was intended. It didn't survive contact with the healthcare system. So I said I'd mention flexibility. Flexibility trumps everything. Flexibility is reason's fourth thing about safety culture that very little people talk about. And really what it is giving people in the moment the privilege, permission, support, training, and encouragement to make the call they need to with imperfect information based on their experience, and not judging them horribly afterwards for making the wrong call or rewarding them too much for making the good call. And it's because in this complex adaptive system of healthcare we work in, there's this thing called requisite variety. And what it means is the variety in the system is always going to exceed the variety in our workforce. And we can't possibly write a protocol, a guideline, a cookbook for every situation because it hasn't happened yet. And there's some other concepts there that I think are wonderful. Uncertain safety is just around making a rule in an uncertain situation to try and make it safe. You're almost certainly going to create unsafety down the road through the perverse effects of your rules. And at the end of the day, it's around discretion. Protect that discretionary space for people. One of the ways you can support people to be flexible and to live in that discretionary space, it's war stories, or your stories, or stories. That's why I told stories throughout. The grill is useful because it's a story that makes you think. The Swiss cheese is useful, it's a story. The bedpan's useful. These are all useful. And it's actually stories that will help people understand how their work's interconnected and interrelated. And those stories will create better care. Thank you. So we need to find creative ways to add value. And so these are some of the things you might do. I think what I would challenge all of you to do leaving here today is this. When you leave here today, think to yourself in the spirit, which is my team's spirit of relentless, positive iteration. What can I do to make tomorrow better than yesterday? It may be a 16th medication error, or right of medication, or another medication error, and or it may be to tell a story. So I would challenge you to go out in your community with the people you work with and tell some stories and help support this idea of discretionary space, protected at all costs. Let's stop obliterating it. I don't want to see the independent quadruple check. So with that, say thank you.